and this while I'm doing the recording. Big news! The changes that Classic Set is going to be facing has finally been released today, April 20th. So, as the Year of the Kraken approaches, which is the new year of Standard, the first year of Standard, some changes had to be made because some of the Classic cards would just constantly be played and perhaps overshadow all of the new expansions since we're rotating in Standard now. So, here are those cards that are going to change, which will allow new card releases to have an impact on Standard, so to make Hearthstone dynamic, fresh, and fun. I did go to the meeting. There were a few players invited like half a year ago when Blizzard was contemplating what basic and classic cards were going to get changed, the entire idea of Standard, and overall, my thoughts, and I'm just going to prelude this, my thoughts were that they needed to change a lot of cards to make sure that some of the cards didn't stick around forever. Turns out they only changed about 10. However, I feel like the 10 they chose will sufficiently shake things up, and I hope that they continue to change cards in the future so that more cards get introduced. So, we're just going to go straight down this article here. The first class that got hit is Druid. And that's not a surprise, because it turns out when you make any Druid deck, you usually put about 20 of the same cards into the deck. Just from the base Classic set. So no matter what expansions were to get released, you would always keep sticking those 20 cards in. 3 of those cards got changed. Ancient of Lore now has the option of either drawing 1 card or restoring 5 health. So I'm going to kind of review these cards as they are now, as if they're new cards. There was a new card released that drew a card also, which cost about 6 mana, right? 6 mana, 5/5 draw a card. That seems to... I had to look it up, but that's what I remember. From the new set? Do you guys know? Does this card even exist, or am I just imagining things? Oh, Mukla, Tyrant of the Veil. I guess Azure Drake is the card I'm thinking of. It's not really the card, but... And Crusader. Okay, take this part since I actually just looked at how many cards got changed. 12 cards get changed, which, when you look at it across 9 classes, some classes didn't get changed at all. That's like an average of slightly more than 1 class card. So the changes aren't as much as I had hoped, but I feel like the changes will shake things up and make it so that there aren't as many auto-includes. Because even though there's only a few auto-includes taken out, some of the auto-includes getting taken out make some of the other auto-includes not to be as good as well. So Ancient of Lore, it's now either a 7 mana 5/5 draw a card or restore 5 health. So you can compare the draw a card with Azure Drake. 5 mana 4/4 draw a card. Plus 1 spell damage as well, which is still very good in Druid because Wrath and Swipe are still around. So Ancient of Lore was mainly good for the draw 2 cards. When you take down the draw a card, it's like the card is about 1.5 mana less good. And nerfing any card by like 1.5 mana or one card is bad. So playing Ancient of Lore to draw a card is poor. What about restoring 5 health? Well, Paladins have a card called Guardian of Kings, which has not seen play in some time, which is 7 mana, 5/6, restore 6 health. Although you can't target the restore 5. But restore 5 is still quite poor. You can compare that with Shield Maiden as well, which is a 6 mana 5/5, but the armor was used for Shield Slam. Anyways, the main point is this is a serious hit to Druid. Ancient of Lore was in pretty much all the Druid decks except the super aggro Druids. So, tough loss there for a Druid. It's still a flexible card, so the mana cost is still fair, but it's now under the curve of playability. Force of Nature was a card that everyone was whining about. Well, really, Force of Nature Savage Roar, and people were contemplating, is it Force of Nature that's the problem, or is it Savage Roar which is the problem? And the answer, as Blizzard has come up with, is Force of Nature is the problem. Although, this is subtle and interesting. So it gets a completely redesign. There were actually jokes before that Force of Nature would just say summon 3/2/2 Treants. And it turns out that that is what is happening. However, at least we also have a -1 mana, which means it's 5 mana for 6/6 in stats. You can still Force of Nature Savage Roar, it just takes one more turn. Now the main problem with counting Force of Nature as a 6/6 is that it's really vulnerable to 2 damage AoE, and 2 damage AoE is kind of common. You've got cards like Demon Wrath, you've got cards like Consecration, and Blizzard, and others. But this is still a playable card. 5 mana for 6/6 in stats, though the distribution of stats is rather poor. But it still combos with Savage Roar, because you generally want to have a lot of guys out, and Force of Nature gives that, so the heart and soul of Force of Nature Savage Roar is still there. But this is a good change because not only is Force of Nature no longer an auto-include 2-of, but Savage Roar comboed with the fact that you could create 3 guys out of thin air to basically buff Savage Roar by +6 damage. So now Savage Roar is also no longer an auto-include. This is an elegant solution. Honestly, if you had changed Savage Roar, Force of Nature also would not be played. But by keeping Savage Roar, you keep aggro Druid around as a possibility. So, on some kind of thought about how they did this, and you have to assume that Blizzard thinks through all these changes very carefully. I like this. Good job. Keeper of the Grove, an auto-include in every single Druid deck since the game has been released, has finally gotten taken down a peg. So, part of the theme of Silence is that they want Silence, Blizzard wants Silence to not be as powerful. Druid gets to keep their Keeper of the Grove Silence option for 4 mana, and they get to keep their flexibility of choose 1, but the main problem here is a 4 mana 2/2 deal 2 damage isn't that strong. We can compare it with Ironforge Rifleman and Stormpike Commando. Both of the cards don't see play. And Silence a Minion, we have Spellbreaker. Druids actually used to run both Keeper of the Groves as well as Spellbreaker, partly because the 4 mana 2/4 deal 2 damage was quite strong. But removing those 2 stats means that it can no longer kill 2 3/2s and still live. Now it just kills 2 3/2s and then dies in the process. Knocking a card off with 2 stats is a big deal. I think this card also doesn't see much play anymore, though it does hold that flexibility, which might make it have some play. It's better than Stormpike Commando. 3/2s, if they are common, will mean that Keeper of the Grove still sees some play, because you still kill off a 2 health guy, and then you kill off the other 3/2. So that goes into the silence and removal thing. Blizzard's philosophy is that playing big, exciting minions is fun. And we can see in Whispers of the Old Gods, many big, exciting minions with cool effects were printed. Cards that would be less cool if their effect got silenced off, or if they got big game hunted. And so, that goes into the specific neutral changes. Ironbeak Owl gets nerfed to 3 mana. Ironbeak Owl was a card that could be tossed into pretty much any deck, and aggro decks like Face Hunter ran it, sometimes Zoo ran a copy, just because they got to draw a lot of cards. You even saw control decks like Handlock or Reno Lock run a copy, and it occasionally made its way into things like Midrange Paladin too. I mean, not just occasionally, it did make its way. It was just very flexible, so almost every deck had an Ironbeak Owl in it, just as an out to silence something. And of course, over time, Ironbeak Owl got removed from a few of these decks just because better cards got printed, and there were less things that required silenceable off. There were less cards that required getting silenced. But overall, it turns out that if you build your own cool minion, it's cool for your big minion to crush everything. So Owl gets nerfed, we get to see more things. Spellbreaker is probably the new silence of choice, which will make it into sim decks and will not make it into some decks. Whereas Ironbeak Owl will probably never see play anymore. There's not very many cards where if a card gets raised by 2 mana, it still sees play. However, Big Game Hunter is one of those. Big Game Hunter has often just completely taken the spotlight from cards such as Assassinate. Because why play Assassinate when you can play an Assassinate which costs 2 fewer mana and you get a 4/2? So now compared to Assassinate, you are simply getting a 4/2 on top of your Assassinate. This is now going to change into the situational card that it should be. Because before, 3 mana 4/2, okay, you can play it on 3, it's not the end of the world. Against decks that clearly don't have something that has attack 7 or more. But as we print more cards that have 7 or more attack, especially in the Old Gods, we have to make sure that such a flexible removal card isn't ridiculously overpowered. So in the case that there are so many big minions out there, Control versus Control will still run Big Game Hunter, and that will sufficiently punish them, because if they face off against aggro, the Big Game Hunter is actually near unplayable, whereas against aggro you would previously play it as a 3 mana 4/2 and still probably trade with something that costs 3 mana or 2 mana. Big Game Hunter has a long and storied history. For some periods of time, there would be Handlock versus Handlock mirrors. And the winner was usually the person who put 2 Big Game Hunters into their deck, just because it was so ridiculous. You not only kill their 8/8, but you also get a 4/2 for 3 mana. So now this is a proper tech card. Great change, opens up a lot of design space. Hunter's Mark. Some people look at this and are wondering, wait, why? But it turns out that this card is very, very powerful, and perhaps in order to print more powerful Hunter cards in the future, this card has to get nerfed a bit. We can see that there were some control or mid-range Hunter cards already pushed. For example, Call of the Wild is going to be a Hunter card which I expect to see a lot of play in Control Hunter or Mid-Range Hunter. And the new Hunter Legendary, Princess Huhuran, that's also a really strong card, which pushes mid-late game. So for there to be a 0 mana card to basically deal 6 damage, when you do it against a 7 health minion, that's a bit much. So it's now properly placed at 1 mana. It's still really good if a hunter, which is control or mid range, pops around. And it seems like they're making this change in anticipation that a mid range, late mid range, or a control hunter will appear. Okay, Blade Flurry is a big one. So, Blade Flurry, according to Blizzard, is a problem both because of heavy burst damage and board clear. And it being cheap. So, now instead of it doing all of those, it now does none of those. Well, no, it does one of those. Instead of being cheap, board clear, and burst, it is now board clear. Now, let's be clear. Blade Flurry was absolutely ridiculous way back. Well, 2 mana Blade Flurry is ridiculous when you think about it. It's 2 mana it's 2 mana like Flame Strike the board after some preparations have been set up. Or even, it doesn't require preparation sometimes. Literally preparation. You preparation, you oil, and then you Blade Flurry. This would happen over and over again, and it would be a lot of burst damage. Because it basically gave your hero Wind Fury, and it AoE'd the board. It was just a lot. It's actually because of a card like Blade Flurry that Blizzard printed a card like Poisoned Blade. Poisoned Blade is so bad that you can kind of see why Blade Flurry had to get nerfed. I think this is a nerf that Blizzard is making in order for them to make rogues be able to tinker with weapon damage more, which is an interesting design space for them. Just something that they couldn't do before because Blade Flurry existed. So now it's unplayable. Maybe not unplayable. It's been compared to Shadow Flame from Warlock, where you destroy something of yours and you deal damage to all enemy minions. And it is similar. I don't know if Rogue will get any more AoE. I don't know if they need AoE. They seem to be very good at dealing single target damage with cards like Backstab and SI7 Agent. Speaking of Backstab and SI7 Agent, I was perhaps thinking that one of those cards might get changed. But no, Blade Flurry is the one that gets the hit instead. Some people make the comment, wait, Rogue? Rogue isn't even really represented. It's not that good a class. Why are we hitting such an iconic Rogue card? And the answer would be, they do that in order to print better cards for Rogue in the future. Perhaps this opens the design space for a lot more cards like Deadly Poison to be printed. And Assassin's Blades, better weapons as well. So Rogue can become a major weapon class. And there's even a joke going around that says, okay, Blizzard can just delete cards instead of nerfing. And this does seem like an extreme change, but it's still a specific tool that rogues can still use. It just goes to look at, like, in a few years, people will look at the old Blade Flurry and think about, how did this card survive 2 years? But what they won't remember is that rogues didn't used to have all the great cards that they will have 2 years from now. And maybe Blade Flurry is still played. It's possible. Rogues kind of get a payment plan. The first step of the plan would be to buff the weapon. The second part of the plan is just a Blade Flurry when you have only 1 durability left. It's still 4 mana AoE clear. If normal Blade Flurry had never existed, this Blade Flurry might look pretty good. For real. Alright, aggro decks get hit a little bit as well. A Knife Juggler gets changed, which is a change welcomed by a lot of people. There are so many games of Hearthstone where a turn 2 Knife Juggler ends up doing something like 16 damage. 16 damage being roughly it attacks 4 times and then it throws 4 daggers. Now 4 daggers is kind of light. Let's say maybe it does 14 damage. It attacks 3 times and then it throws 5 knives out. So now it's a 2-mana 2/2, which is completely fair because a 2-mana 3/2 of this ability was a bit much. It's a repeatable damage dealing effect. I actually think this card might even see play even though it's a 3-mana 2/2. Whoa, I got ahead of myself a bit there. I think this card might see play even though it is a 2-mana 2/2. Now granted, a lot of the cards that Knife Juggler was good with, like Haunted Creeper, are getting rotated out with Standard as well. But this is looking a little bit into Wild, making sure that Knife Juggler plus Haunted Creeper isn't still a thing. And yeah, I mean, it's just a really strong effect, which does deserve to be on a card that's a 2/2. Leopard Gnome's nerf is very severe. But when you looked at how much damage Leopard Gnome would be pumping out, it's very realistic that you play the Leopard Gnome on turn 1, it attacks on turn 2, and it attacks on turn 3. And maybe sometimes your opponent can't deal with it on turn 3, and then on turn 4 they attack into it. But either way, the Leopard Gnome usually got in for 4 damage, and then the Death Rattle dealt 2 damage, and then maybe you had to use a minion to kill the Leopard Gnome, which meant that the Leopard Gnome would deal the 2 damage to the minion as well, which is somewhere between 4, 6, or even 8 damage for a 1-mana card. That's a lot. So now it's a 1/1. I actually think this is kind of severe. I would have made it a 1-mana 2/1, Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to the enemy hero, but hey, this kills the Leopard Gnome. You can still kind of compare it to a card like Sinister Strike, which is 1 mana, deal 3 damage to face. This card, if it attacks once, is kind of like deal 3 damage to face, and then maybe your opponent uses a minion to kill the Leopard Gnome, and it kind of does 4 damage. Anyways, the point is we're not going to be seeing much of this Icky card anymore. Which is good news because I feel Icky was not a card that many people wanted to play against on turn 1. Third little bit of a hit to the Super Face decks, which pretty much always ran Knife Juggler, Leopard Gnome, and Arcane Golem. Arcane Golem, Blizzard is learning that Charge is a bit OP. So Arcane Golem gets the hit as well. Now it's very similar to Dancing Swords. Instead of Death Rattle, your opponent draws a card, though. It's Battle Cry. Give your opponent a mana crystal. So, if you valued Wild Growth as a proper 2-mana card, then Arcane Golem is kind of like a 5-mana 4/4, because you're giving the opponents the effect of not only 2 mana in the Wild Growth, but you're also drawing them a card, because they have to draw the Wild Growth and then play the 2 mana, pay the 2 mana for Wild Growth. So it's like a 5-mana 4/4, give your opponent a Wild Growth card that costs 0. That makes it look like really bad. It is really bad. No one will run this card anymore. Except rookies. This card probably could have been a 4/5. It could have been like the first 3-mana 4/5. Fun trivia. I was asked that question in the Archon House of Scamas trivia. Like a 3-mana 4/5 seems really good, but it kind of pushes your opponent immediately to 4 mana if you're playing it on 3, which means this is almost like Yeti then. Anyways, what was my point? This is a really bad card now. And I think it would have been better as a 4/5, which still probably wouldn't be played, but might at least have seen some experimentation in super high risk decks. Molten Giant. So Molten Giant was the card that was most often a 16 stat card played for near 0, 1, or 2 mana. And that was really strong. However, many of the decks weren't able to play Molten Giant even then, because you would have the risk of getting burst down by cards like Force of Nature Savage or Arcane Golem. With burst damage going down, Molten Giant is less risky to play, so that's why they hit specifically Molten Giant. One might wonder, why not Mountain Giant? The answer to that is that tap Mountain Giant is not actually that good. It's really, for hand luck, the fact that near the late game they can go Molten Giant, Defender of Argus. That was so scary. And the hand locks were held in check from all this burst damage. But so that the decks would have to like kind of keep the hand lock around 15 health so that they didn't have too much of a discount. Now in order to play Molten Giant for 5 mana, you would need to be at 10 health, which is terrifying and near impossible. And in order to play it for free, you need to be at 5 health. So it's, when you think about it, it's actually kind of crazy that a card gets nerfed by 5 mana. But hey, Molten Giant. I think the card will still see some fringe play, but it's going to be much more difficult, like by a lot. And by fringe play, I mean like maybe people will experiment with it and then decide it's bad. But again, you have to see how the meta shakes up. If there's no direct damage from any deck, then it's still good. Like, if you can't actually go over the taunts and hit face, then say you're at 5, you still just go Molten Giant, Defender of Argus. And then you still have 18 health of taunts. And Silence has gone away, and BGH has gone away. So how are you going to get through the taunts? So it depends on how many classes out there can fireball your opponent, and whether or not Mage is like really represented in the meta. And, you know, that's Fireball, there's Kill Command. Fireball is 6, Kill Command Hero Power is 7. But you can still do this Molten Defender on, what, 8 mana? The Moltens cost 3 apiece. That would cost 10 mana, or 8 mana with Sun Fury. And then on a following turn you heal. So it just depends on how much over the taunt damage you can do. How much over the taunt damage is in the meta. Molten Giant might still see some play, in the case that that doesn't exist. But now there's actual counterplay. Like now, if there are Molten Giant decks out there, then a good counter to Molten Giant is decks that do damage past taunt. And that's healthy for a metagame, because then it actually shifts a bit more. Master of Disguise might seem like a strange nerf to people, but I've actually been talking about this card a bit, mostly because through the various Blizzard-related visits that I've had, it's just been whispered that Master of Disguise was randomly going to be a card that didn't seem OP, which got nerfed. It's just to open the room for more design space. Makes sense. A card like Animated Armor would be ridiculous if it were neutral. But since it is a rogue card, so therefore Animated Armor had to be a mage card. We can probably assume that there will be some rogue cards or neutral cards that are now absolutely ridiculous if you manage to stealth them permanently. Not that that is ever possible anymore. This card will pretty much never see any play anymore. similar to how it has not seen play in the past. And that's it. So, to recap, the big changes made are basically Druid loses 4 class cards. Keeper of the Grove, Force of Nature, Ancient of Lore, and Savage Roar, because Force of Nature and Savage Roar combine so often. It can still combine, and Savage Roar can still be played in the very aggressive Druid decks, but it's no longer an auto-include into everything. That, and combined with Big Game Hunter getting nerfed, and most Druid decks also ran one of those, that's like 9 cards out of the typical Druid deck. And I was alluding to earlier about how Druids would just auto-include about 20 to 20... What? One moment. Okay. Where was I? So, now the Druid class has 9 cards that aren't auto-includes anymore, which is great for the game, because it means we're going to see a lot more different. We're going to see Druid not be the same thing. And with Savage Roar still in, they can still be super aggressive, although in the super aggressive decks, they lose Knife Juggler and Leopard Gnome, but not necessarily Ancient of Lore, because if you got aggressive enough, you didn't actually run Ancient of Lore. But yeah, a lot of cards change from those classes. From the aggro decks, they lose 4 cards, Knife Juggler and Leopard Gnome, and they possibly lose some Arcane Golems. And then from all the other classes out there, a while ago I did a standard rotation theory craft of the current decks out there, which ones would still be good moving forward. And the 3 that I came up with as good were Druid. Actually, I came up with 4. I came up with Druid, but we had already known prior that a lot of Druid cards would likely get nerfed, so it would probably see change anyways. So Druid is going to see a lot of rebuilding. Actually, there were 5 decks that I thought were good. So there was Druid. Another one was Face Shaman. Face Shaman loses Leopard Gnome. It loses Knife Juggler a little bit, though Knife Juggler wasn't really played. Face Shaman might seem scary, however, with Leopard Gnome nerfed as well as Face Shaman not being that strong a deck to start with, I don't anticipate Face Shaman being that good, even though it loses not that much. I thought Murloc Paladin was going to be a pretty strong contender since it doesn't lose that much. However, what I didn't know at the time is that the reward set is also rotating out. A reward set being Captain's Parrot and Old Murkai. And Old Murkai getting lost means anything can happen is a lot worse when it can't summon the Old Murkai. Let's see, what else? There was Rogue. Rogue was going to be pretty good too. It lost not that much. You could use the Gadgetzan Auctioneer, you could use the Tomb Pillager, but there's a big card that gets changed out of that deck, which is Blade Flurry. Blade Flurry hit is huge on that deck. That deck might still operate, but it's going to have to go a little bit of a different direction. And finally, there's Freeze Mage. There's actually some criticism that, wait, out of all the decks that are getting rotated into Standard, Freeze Mage seems to not lose that much. But they did lose Mad Scientist. That's about it. One thing to remember, though, is that Freeze Mage has already been dealt with in the past. Their Blizzard got nerfed, their Frost Nova got nerfed, their Cone of Cold got nerfed. it's possible that things will do fine without Freeze Mage getting hit any further. And they do have that constant counter of Control Warrior. One of their main opponents, Druid, has gotten nerfed to the ground though, especially the ones that are scary to Freeze Mages, the Force Savage Burst. So I'm sure Blizzard thought a lot about Freeze Mage and whether or not to hit them, and it turns out that Freeze Mage gets spared this time around, but we'll see. There is still an Eater of Secrets card out there, but against Freeze Mage, Kazan Mystic was actually better. So those are the changes. A little opinion piece by me at the end here. So when a lot of the Hearthstone pro slash media streamer type people got invited to the Blizzard Summit about half a year ago, where they were first contemplating about this big change to standard. Um, I was one of the ones that was pretty vocal about not necessarily keeping all of the classic or basic set in standard because I wanted there to be more fluidity in changes. But if there's always a base set, then you always put in, I argued, you always put in Ancient of Lore, you put in Force of Nature, Savage Roar, you put in Keeper of the Grove, as well as the things that are still around. Innervate, Wild Growth, Swipe, Druid of the Claw. By the way, Druid of the Claw is not actually an auto-include necessarily now. Wrath. But it turns out that that's it. There's not that many cards that stick around. And also, an assurance made is that this is kind of a light first pass at the standard cards of the base set. And there can be more of that change later. Maybe next year, Freeze Mage gets hit a little bit harder in the case that Freeze Mage runs the spotlight for one more year. Maybe if Face Deck continue to be really strong, maybe Abusive Sergeant gets hit. So these changes are going to be constantly reviewed on a yearly basis still. I'm pretty happy with this on a first pass. It seems like all of the standard decks, outside of specifically Face Shaman, which in my opinion is not that strong of a deck, and Freeze Mage, which is a kind of a question mark right now on whether or not it's that strong. It's certainly a very skill intensive deck to play. And Blizzard has a lot of statistics about how much decks win. And Freeze Mage is specifically a deck that can be countered by Control Warrior very easily, as well as burst decks. So we'll see moving forward. If it were up to me, I'd probably have added about 10 more cards on this list. But that's because I am someone who is a mover and a shaker. Really broadly, I would probably have changed, not from Druid, but out of the other 8 classes, maybe I'd change one card out of each of them. Just to make it so that there weren't as many cards that keep being in every deck. And perhaps Abusive Sergeant. So that would come out to be maybe 7 or 8 more cards. But it is completely fine that Blizzard is a bit more tame on this one, because just the very fact that they're eliminating 2 sets and introducing a new standard for rotation is a big deal. And perhaps next year they'll change it, which is perfectly fine to keep things constantly shaking up. I mean, from what cards would get changed, since I am getting asked that a lot. Really broadly, a card from each set, a card from each class which is always played in their class. I guess I can go over it real quick. Druids, I think they got hit hard enough. Hunter, they changed the Hunter's Mark. That's perfectly fine. Good enough for me. Although I would perhaps have changed the Vanaheimane. Mage, there's a lot of cards from Mage out there which are run in a lot of decks. I was even, like, kind of just thinking, you know, Frostbolt, Fireball, those are in basically every Mage deck. Can we tune down one of those? Maybe something as simple as Mage Fireball goes from 6 damage to 5 damage. Eh? Maybe. Paladin, Consecration's in almost every deck, but you can't really weaken that by too much. Right at this moment, I'm just kind of stating off the top of my head what I might change, which is like one extra card from each deck to shake things up more. Priest, maybe that can just get, maybe Priest gets a pat on the head. They're like, okay, fine, you can pass. Rogue, they got hit with the Blade Flurry. Shaman, what is that strong for Shaman? Maybe something from the Face Shaman suite, which wouldn't affect that much else. Hard to say what that would be. Maybe Rockbiter only does 2? Maybe? And Warlock, I actually can't think of anything that's too bad for it off the top of my head. And for Warrior, maybe Execute. Execute is obviously like a signature card from Warrior. And Fire War Axe. Both of those are very signature cards, but moving forward, next year, I wouldn't be surprised if one of those got changed. Anyways, that's just a quick thought on all of them. Oh yeah, Paladin, maybe Tyrion Fordring. Tyrion Fordring is absolutely ridiculous. And for Priest, perhaps Power Word Shield. If they weren't, and I'd of course take a look at the popularity of each class and the success rate of each class, decide whether or not such a card even needed to be nerfed in their class. It's just kind of a great balancer. We pull everything more towards about even of a win rate. That's just my quick spitball, though. Now, one of the cards that constantly gets a mob mentality on is Divine Favor. Maybe Divine Favor is worth talking about for a moment, just because so many people are a little bit annoyed that it didn't get changed. I'm going to say that I think Divine Favor is perfectly fine. Yes, it feels bad, especially the people who visit forums. They tend to be the more, intellectual types, and I say that with almost jokingly because do intellectual types mainly play control decks? If you're playing a control deck, you would like to think so, but we intellectual types, we can hit the face too, FYI. Anyways, it feels really bad when your opponent is down to 0 cards and they top deck a card and they play Divine Favor and then they draw 7 cards. But it turns out that that's in a specific matchup, and perhaps such a card is good design because it's specifically good against control decks. In a more realistic world, Divine Favor is a serious risk that you run when playing your deck, and there's a really interesting choice on whether you even run any Divine Favor, or maybe 1 or maybe 2 copies, because if you draw both copies of Divine Favor, it's actually a complete disaster. And in certain matchups, Divine Favor is the worst card in your deck. In fact, in a lot of matchups, the card is quite bad. So I think that Divine Favor is fine. Perhaps next year they can look at it. But I am one who doesn't really see a problem with Divine Favor. And that's coming from me. I play a lot of control decks. And I am like the victim of Divine Favor a lot of the times. I tap it as handlock. I have like mid-range control decks, which usually go. The game plan is to like go into the late game. I'm the mayor of Valley Town, and I think Divine Favor is fine. They can steal my value, that's fine. Alright, so those are the changes. And that's my opinion on. And that's also my personal opinion on the implementation of the changes. But the baseline of what you should consider is that I'm very happy with these changes. They probably hit about the bare minimum of cards in order to change things up a significant amount, as well as open up a lot of design space in the future. So I look forward to seeing what everyone comes up with when all of the Old Gods cards are released, and it's going to just be a complete Wild West for a while for Standard. And that is what a lot of players have been looking forward to for a while. Alright, anything else that I should address in the meantime? Are we happy? We did the review finally. Hooray. Alex Straza, that's certainly a card that they must have discussed at length. I guess, okay. Jens, you can put this segment into earlier part. Alex Straza is surely a card. You can put this right before the Divine Favor part. Alex Straza is surely a card that the Hearthstone team discussed at length as one of the cards to get changed, because it hits two main decks. It hits Control Warrior, it hits Freeze Mage, and overall it's just a very powerful effect which opens a lot of combo opportunities. I think that Alex Straza might have made for a really interesting change if it went from set someone's health to 15 to set someone's health to 20. Because one, that rewards greater control play of using Alex Straza on yourself. Two, the Alex Straza route usually has your opponent staying around 30. So you Alex your opponent and it basically does 5 less damage to it. I think slipping in that change would have pleased a lot of people. And yes, in some ways it even makes Alex Straza stronger, but it makes Alex Straza stronger from the perspective of... It doesn't really make Alex Straza stronger. It hurts Alex Straza in the places where people are annoyed by it. You get set to 15 and then you get Fireball, Firebolt, Frostbolt, and then, you know, if you gain 5 extra life off of Alex Straza, okay. Besides, isn't Alex Straza supposed to bring life? So why is it only set you at 15? Just saying. Do I think a year is too long between potential rounds of nerfs? It's certainly slow, but it gets there. Now, I completely missed the opportunity Okay, here, slip this into the Molten Giant section, Jens. Now, indeed, good news for you people running the Holy Wrath Molten Giant combo. You can deal 5 more damage, which sets up the kill for these Holy Wrath decks a lot greater. I worded that extremely poorly. Good news to those of you running Holy Wrath Paladin decks. This is a huge buff to your deck. Now instead of dealing 10 damage and then Holy Wrathing for 20, all you have to do is deal 5 damage. This should not really be a problem though, because Holy Wrath is very inconsistent of a deck. And Molten Giant is near unplayable in that deck. Alright, great. No, Muster for Battle doesn't need a rework. Okay. And good news, as always, if you own these cards, you can get some dust value because you'll get your full crafting cost disenchanting for any of these changes, as is typical. What cards do I think will replace other cards in Standards is Life? Well, I mean, that's up to Whispers of the Old Gods, right? We still have a lot of cards we haven't seen yet, so once we see new questions, or once we see new cards, then I'll be able to respond to that. I have no idea right now. By the way, now that Ancient of Lore has gotten nerfed, Mukla, Tyrant King, looks a lot better, right? Hmm. Is the card dump tomorrow? I'm gonna have to do it from... Wait, what time is it? Oh, I'll be on a flight. Ah. Alright guys, let's take a poll.